By faith, the people crossed the Red Sea as if on dry land, but the Egyptians, when they attempted to do the same, were drowned. By faith, the walls of Jericho fell down after they had been encircled for 7 days. By faith, Rahab the harlot did not perish with those who were disobedient, because she had given friendly welcome to the spies. And what more shall I say? For time would fail me to tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, of David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, enforced justice, received promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched raging fire, escaped the edge of the sword, won strength out of weakness, became mighty in war, and put foreign armies to flight. Women received their dead by resurrection. Some were tortured, refusing to accept release that they might rise again to a better life. Others suffered mocking and scourging, and even chains and imprisonment. They were stoned. They were sawn in two. They were killed with the sword. They went about in skins of sheep and goats, destitute, afflicted, ill-treated, of whom the world was not worthy, wandering over deserts and mountains, and in dens and caves of the earth. And all these, though well attested by their faith, did not receive what was promised, since God had foreseen something better for us, that apart from us, they should not be made perfect. This is the word of God for the people of God.
I love this moment in the passage where the writer of Hebrews is recounting all these great moments from Old Testament history. And he says, what more shall I say? For time would fail me if I told it all, right? Like there's just only so much time. You're wondering how much time is there for the sermon. I think about that moment in the movie Sleepless in Seattle. Tom Hanks is playing this guy, Sam, whose young wife has died. They have a little boy named Jonah. And Jonah thinks Sam, his dad, needs to be getting on with his life, so he calls in one night to one of these radio therapists named Dr. Marcia Fieldstone. And Sam isn't expecting this, but suddenly he's on the phone. And so he's not sure what to do, and Dr. Fieldstone asked him on national radio, what was so special about your wife? And his response is, well, how long is your program? This passage, in effect, says, how much time do you have? And the writer begins to recount all these great things that happen in the history of the Bible. Now, this is the time of year that we try to get you to sign up for Bible studies, and sometimes I think you forget what the Bible is. Sometimes we think the Bible, we think it's sort of some pithy, sweet, pious sayings, and maybe you don't feel so sweet and pious yourself, so you think, well, Bible study's not really for me. But let me just tell you that the Bible is full of all this history. History actually matters, and if we knew more about it, we'd function better in the world. I heard somebody the other day say, this is the worst political season in American history. This is so wrong. Our predecessors would put these mamby-pambies today in the shade. When Lyndon Johnson was first running for the Senate in Texas, he went out with some cronies one night, and they were in a cemetery registering fraudulently dead voters. And one guy passed one stone, the word, it was a little bit hard to read, it was a little grown over, so he skipped it, and Johnson said, no, go back. He said, that guy has as much right to vote as anybody else in the cemetery. And then in 1856, there was a debate on the floor of Congress. Charles Sumner from the state of Massachusetts stood up and made an anti-slavery speech. Preston Brooks from my native South Carolina took exception to it, took his walking cane and he beat the daylights out of Charles Sumner. He almost killed him. He was out of the Senate for 3 years before he could return. And the cane splintered, and people that were in favor of slavery grabbed them up like they were precious relics. Oh, this is from the cane that Preston Brooks used almost to kill Charles Sumner. This is nothing that we see today, right? And the Bible is kind of like that. If you actually read the Bible, it's got the same kind of stuff. People misbehaving, dysfunctional families, you got genocides, you got warfare, you got politicians that don't know what they're doing. The book's just a mess. So actually, if you want a book of pious platitudes, the Bible's not really the book for you. But if you're if your life's kind of like what I just described, like it's a little kind of chaos, a little confusion, you got a little darkness, a little dysfunction in your family, this is the book. This is the book for you. Sometimes people do well, and they're applauded for this. This is part of what we read in this passage of Hebrews. This is part of what we read in this passage of Hebrews. He narrates all these things that God did that were great. He delivers the people from captivity in Egypt. And they wander in the wilderness stupidly for 40 years. And then finally they come into the promised land. And the first place they come to is Jericho. And we heard the choir sing this great Moses Hogan anthem about Joshua. You wanted to sing along with that, didn't you? Like, Joshua fit the battle. I could feel it in you. You were about to join in. We'll do a sing-along, Jimmy, next year. One time, this battle of Jericho is misunderstood. Sometimes we think it's just, oh, they're just conquering new territory, but it's more than that. What you have to know is that the Canaanites were Egyptian wannabes. See, the reason that the Israelites had to get out of Egypt is in Egypt there was economic oppression, there was cruel slavery, the mistreatment of people for personal gain, and in Canaan they wanted to be just like the Egyptians. So the people in Jericho and all these other cities, they wanted to grow up to be like Egypt. And God doesn't care for that kind of economic system. God doesn't care for that kind of mistreatment of people. Of course, then what happened is they come and then they go into Jericho after the walls come tumbling down and they exterminate the population. You see, I'm pretty convinced that Rowan Williams, the former Archbishop of Canterbury, is right, is that he said, you got all this stuff in the Bible. And he says that that's what God wants you to read. And that if you read that, you learn about God, but it doesn't mean that God likes everything that's in the Bible. And I would suggest to you, when they exterminate populations in God's name, God says, oh, no, you got that so very wrong. There's so much in the Bible that's not a go thou and do likewise, right? And this is one of those cases. He goes on with various stories, Gideon and David and all these. I love just a few of these I want to lift up for you today. In verse 33, it praises those Old Testament heroes who enforced justice. And that sounds like the kind of thing we might want in America, except we don't know these ancient words for justice. We think of justice as, that statue outside the Supreme Court where justice is blind. Justice has no bias. Justice is fair. The good are rewarded, the bad are punished. This is American justice. The Bible's justice is not blind. In the Bible's justice, God looks very closely at each person and is entirely biased. God is absolutely biased in favor of you. And God is absolutely biased in favor of the person that has the least. God is absolutely biased in favor of the person that everybody else leaves out. That's what justice is in the Bible. Justice is when the poorest are cared for. Justice is when nobody is left out. A just society in the Bible is a society that makes sure that there's nobody who has to do without. Everybody gets a fair shake at things. The unjust society is the one that's willing to let some be left out and some suffer while others gain. Hebrews praises those who enforced justice. Verse 35, I love this. Women received their dead by resurrection. He must be thinking of that moment when Elijah the prophet went by the brook Kerith and found a widow there who only had a little bit of food left and just a little boy, and then the little boy died. It's really all she had. Imagine her devastation. But Elijah prayed over the boy, and the boy came back to life. And that great story in the New Testament, Jesus is coming to this Roman soldier's house to try to cure the girl, but on the way he hears the weeping and the wailing. The little girl has already died. So sad, but Jesus comes in and he prays. He says, Talitha cum, little girl, rise up. And the girl comes back to life, and there's weeping, great joy, laughter in that household. I think of the joy of Mary and Martha. Their brother Lazarus has died, but Jesus comes and summons him out of the tomb. And we think about Easter, whose joy was greater than Mary, the mother of Jesus? I mean, think about that. She stood at the foot of the cross. She saw her precious son. She saw the lifeblood that she had given him draining out of him. Her grief was so great, but then on Easter morning, when he was raised, whose joy was greater and his mothers. We think about anyone that we've loved and lost, this promise of God of a restoration, to be with them again. It's so great. Here's an interesting thing. Many of the people that are mentioned in this passage, today we would call refugees. They didn't have the term refugee then, but that's what they were. They were God's people, and then they were oppressed, and they had to flee their country and live in strange places, and they were just running for their life at all times. They were refugees. I don't know if you've been watching the Olympics like I have, just been glued to it every night. The swimming's really been amazing. Michael Phelps, man, 23 gold medals. There are no gold medals in preaching, but, he's 20, it's just amazing, but let me suggest to you, he is not the greatest swimmer in this Olympics. The greatest swimmer in this Olympics is a young 18-year-old girl named Yusra Mardini. Yusra Mardini, she actually swam in one heat and came in last, but she's the best swimmer in this Olympics. You see, she's from Syria. She was on that refugee team. Did you see that opening night? The Americans came in, the Belgians came in, the French came in, the Brazilians came in, everybody was very excited. And then they had a refugee team. So think about that. Athletes who live in countries where it's so violent, you can't even survive there. You escape, and they had a team for you at that school. The way Yusra escaped from Syria is pretty interesting. She'd made it through Turkey all the way to the coast, and she and some other people got on a boat. Now, the boat was designed to hold 6 people, but there were 18 of them, so desperate to get out of the violence that is Syria. So the boat's hopelessly overcrowded. The engine fails. It begins taking on water. It appears that everybody's going to drown. Yusra, who's a great swimmer, jumps into the water and tows that boat for 3 hours and saves 17 lives. She's the best swimmer in the Olympics, and she's a refugee, and we have refugees here in Charlotte, and sometimes people want to politicize that, and let's just be clear, the Bible is very fond of people that are on the run for their lives, and we have churches here in Charlotte, our United Methodist churches, especially in the eastern corridor out toward Albemarle Road and Central and so on, that are heroically caring for refugees here in Charlotte, finding them jobs and housing and medical care. It's a wonderful thing. Verse 34, Hebrews speaks of those who won strength out of weakness. Now think about that. They won strength out of weakness. We get this wrong all the time as Americans. We think it's all about strengths. And maybe at work you have a Strengths Finder Index, and you can say, my strengths are these things. Or you have other strengths. You have your resume, you have your degree. I went to Duke University. That's like a great credential, isn't it? And have these things, and we're showing how strong we are. And if you're in an interview, you tell everyone how strong that you are. But the Bible, everything's reversed. And this, I mentioned Gideon earlier in the story. This is so interesting. Gideon has to fight the Midianites, so he rouses an army of 32,000, and God says, you got way too many soldiers. Which is interesting. And they thinned the 32,000 down to 300, which is a really weak army, nowhere near as big as the Midianites. And then God says, now we're ready to go. And they defeat them. Because see, God uses human weakness to glorify God's strength. Paul says, my strength is perfected in weakness. It's why in emotionally healthy spirituality, we tell you things like, don't look to your strengths, look inside yourself and find that part of you that's broken. That part of you that's dysfunctional, that part of you that's dark, that you hide from everybody else. Maybe you hide it from yourself. You don't really look at yourself in the mirror. There's that dark part of you in there. God says, strength is perfected in weakness. Go to your dark place. That is the place where God can use you. I know that this is true for me. If I've done any good in my life as a pastor, it's not because I'm smart or have a Duke degree or work really hard. If I've done any good, it's because God has used what is broken in me. God has used my wounds. God has used my dysfunction. Here's the last thing. I know I'm talking too long. This passage in Hebrews is so fascinating. It talks about these amazing things that happen. And you kind of wish you could be one of those great. I watch the Olympics and I think, oh, I wish I'd won a gold medal sometime in something. It's ridiculous, right? And you kind of wish you might have been one of these Old Testament saints. He chronicles all of this, and then he says this, but God had foreseen something better for us. How about that? Like above David, Isaiah, all the great heroes of old, God has planned something better for us. And what that something better is, Hebrews defines as perfection. And when I hear that, I recoil a little because I battle kind of against my own perfectionism. It's just an insecurity that, right, is worried that things will never quite be good enough. So I try to make it perfect so that maybe it'll be good enough. Maybe you're afflicted with the same malady. God's not saying you got to go be perfect, but perfection is the goal. And here's the thing. God's plan for you is that God will perfect you eventually, in time. God will not leave you imperfect. God will perfect you. And what do we do in the meantime? We do what John Wesley taught us. This is one of his favorite passages. He always asked the early Methodists, are you going on to perfection? I used to be bugged by that question until I heard a preacher talking about it one time say, well, if you're not headed toward perfection, where are you headed? Like, I kind of like that. You at least try to head toward perfection. You try to be holy. And then what is the perfection that God gives anyway? And Hebrews defines it in a really interesting way. It says the perfection is rest. Rest. I love that Jimmy had us sing, be still and know that I am God. The world defines everything by you and your frenetic activity and trying to get it done and perfectionism. But in God, it's all about rest. We can rest in God's mercy. We can rest in God's strength. We can rest in God's holy, loving hands. Wish I had time to talk about it, but I don't. The next passage, Hebrews chapter 12, the writer imagines the Olympics and the moment in the Olympics that he had seen, which is the marathon. We haven't seen that yet, but it's coming. He's imagining the running of the marathon, the discipline that it required for a runner to be able to run the marathon, and he urges the Christians to run with perseverance the race that is set before us. The discipline is hard, but there's fruit in the end. So let us strengthen the weak hands. Let us strengthen the wobbly knees with our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith. My brothers and sisters, let us be at peace, at rest with God. Thanks be to God.
Hey, thank you for watching, and we hope you got something out of that. If you have any feedback for us, any response that was helpful to you, we would love to hear that. Please let us know. And everything that we put out is free, and we want it to be that way, but if you're able and feel led to support the mission of our church or the cost of providing this online content, here's how to do so.